Hello, everyone, and welcome to this forum of the Bolshevik tendency. We'll start now. It's about 5:05 London time here, where I'm based. My name's Roxanne. I'm going to be chairing today's meeting. Alan is our speaker today. The title of our meeting, or the subject of our meeting, is about the Green New Deal, and Alan's going to be talking for about 30 minutes. Looking at some of the responses of eco-socialists like John Bellamy Foster and Andreas Malm, and looking at their response to the Green New Deal and how revolutionaries should be relating to the Green New Deal. This is a Zoom webinar function, so if anyone who hasn't been on these forums before, the way we'll do it is we'll promote you to a panelist when you want to speak. So you'll have the same view as me and Alan here at the moment, where you're able to speak and use your video if you want to. You don't have to. And you unmute yourself to speak. You'll have a short disconnection when we promote you to a panelist. So don't worry, it might look like you're disconnecting, but if after a couple of seconds, you'll be connected as a panelist, and then vice versa. We reverse you to attendee after you've spoken, and you'll have a short disconnection as you go back to attendee status. We will have an open round of discussion after Alan has presented, and we'll probably have 5-minute rounds of people speaking, timed rounds where I'll bring you in as I see you if you want to speak, and hopefully we'll have time for a second round with a summary by Alan after each round. And our meeting will be about 2 hours in total, finishing at 7 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, or British Summer Time as it is here now. And yeah, so when you want to talk, raise your hand with using the raise hand function. Just so you know as well, we're going to be we are recording this, and we're going to put on our website later a copy of the audio file, which is the discussion afterwards, as well as Alan's talk. But we won't be sharing any video, and that's everything. So over to Alan.
Okay, this is actually the Bolshevik Tendency's 5th of these online forums that we've been doing during the COVID lockdown. And it's also the 2nd of these forums dealing with the ecological crisis facing humanity. There's actually a very good reason for this repetition. And that's because unless there is a qualitative change in humanity's relationship with the environment within the next 2 or 3 or 4 decades, it is highly likely that one of the climate change tipping points will occur and a catastrophic ecological collapse will become unstoppable. In their recent book, Robbery of Nature, John Bellamy Foster and Brett Clark described this reality as follows. So they said, in order to avoid catastrophic climate change, it will be necessary, science tells us, to find a way to keep the fossil fuels in the ground. At the same time, it will be necessary to reverse the other planetary rifts, such as species extinction, the rupture of the nitrogen and phosphorus cycle, ocean acidification, the depletion or overuse of fresh water, the elimination of natural vegetative ground cover, and the degradation of the soil, in order not to close off the future. Here too, we are forced to confront the nature of our social system. The really inconvenient truth is that there is no possible way to accomplish any, much less all, of these things other than breaking with the underlying logic of the accumulation of capital. The grim reality is that climate change and other planetary rifts demand urgent action within a timeline of a generation or less, leaving virtually no options other than revolutionary social change. Andreas Malm, in his book, Corona, Climate, Chronic Emergency, War, Communism in the 21st Century, outlines what he sees as being necessary in response to this. I think he's generally correct. So he says what's necessary is comprehensive, airtight planning. Everybody knows this, few say it. One can obviously not rely on spontaneous cessation of demand or on people just quitting travel. There would have to be a continuous substitution of one kind of energy for another over the transitional period. Or, and he starts quoting here, a single economic plan covering the whole country and all branches of productive activity. This plan must be drawn up for a number of years for the whole epoch that lies before us. and that's citing Leon Trotsky. Now, of course, in the context of the ecological crisis, that should be a plan for the whole world, not just one country. Malm goes on to note, one can, of course, find this idea so repugnant that one would rather give up on the climate of the earth. And that is indeed the choice the dominant classes and the governments wake up to make every morning. Something interesting has been happening over the last period, and that is it's not just self-describing eco-socialists like John Bellamy Foster or eco-Leninists such as Andreas Malm who recognise the need for massive social change in response to the ecological crisis. Increasingly, this has been the case that scientists have been indicating that this is also necessary. In January this year, a group of prominent ecological scientists co-wrote a paper called Underestimating the Challenges of Avoiding a Ghastly Future, interesting title, in which they stated, gravity of the situation requires fundamental changes to global capitalism, education and equality, which include inter alia the abolition of perpetual economic growth, properly pricing externalities, a rapid exit from fossil fuel use, strict regulation of markets and property acquisition, reining in corporate lobbying, and the empowerment of women. The reason for this is because there is a sobering reality facing us, and that is that the ecological crisis continues to worsen on virtually every front. For some examples of just how bad that is, I would refer people to the World Meteorological Organization, and it's hardly the most radical organization in the world, so if they come out and indicate things are bad, you know they really are. So they have a State of the Global Climate 2020 report, which starts with a number of key messages, including the following selection from those key messages. Concentrations of major greenhouse gases, CO2, CH4, and NTO continue to increase in 2019 and 2020. Despite developing La Nina conditions, global mean temperature in 2020 is on course to be one of the 3 warmest on record. The past 6 years, including 2020, are likely to be the 6 warmest years on record. Sea level has increased throughout the altimeter record, but recently sea level has risen at a higher rate due partly to increased melting of ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica. 2019 saw the highest ocean heat content on record, and the rate of warming over the past decade was higher than the long-term average, indicating continued uptake of heat from the radiative imbalance caused by greenhouse gases. In the Arctic, the annual minimum sea ice extent was the 2nd lowest on record, and the record low sea ice extents were observed in the months of July and October. Heavy rain and extensive flooding occurred over large parts of Africa and Asia in 2020. Heavy rain and flooding affected much of the Sahel and Greater Horn of Africa, the Indian subcontinent, and neighbouring areas, China, Korea, and Japan, and parts of Southeast Asia at various times of the year. With 30 named storms as of 17th of November 2020, the North Atlantic hurricane season had its largest number of named storms on record, with a record number making landfall in the United States of America. The last storm of the season to date, Iota, was also the most intense, reaching Category 5. Severe drought affected many parts of interior South America in 2020, with the worst affected areas being northern Argentina, Paraguay, and the western border areas of Brazil. Estimated agricultural losses were near $3 billion in Brazil, with additional losses in Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. Climate and weather events have triggered significant population movements and have severely affected vulnerable people on the move, including in the Pacific region and Central America. So, not a happy situation. Something I've recently heard is that some environmentalists have been pointing to the capitalist governments around the world pouring billions into the development of vaccines against COVID. And I've heard them putting this forward as some kind of proof that it is possible for the same to be done to stop the ecological collapse we're now living through the early stages of. Unfortunately, those billions for fighting COVID pale in significance compared to the trillions that have been committed to fossil fuel use by the world's state-owned fossil fuel companies, who, to quote a Guardian article on 9th February this year, and this is government, state-owned oil and gas companies, are poised to invest about $1.9 trillion or 1.4 trillion pounds in the next decade in projects that would destroy any prospect of meeting the Paris Agreement climate goals. And of course, we need to be cognizant that those Paris Agreement goals are now generally accepted as being insufficient, but we're not even going to make those. So along with this government investment, a 2020 study called Banking on Climate Change was carried out by 6 environmental groups. This outlined how those state investments are dwarfed by the private sector financial market's support for fossil fuels. In total, the world's biggest banks have put $2.7 trillion into fossil fuel industries since the 2015 Paris Agreement. While investments to the biggest coal, oil and gas producers fell in the immediate aftermath of the Paris Agreement, researchers found that in 2019, these investments shot back up by some 40%. So that's the reality of how international capitalism remains committed to fossil fuels. And despite all the crocodile tears and all the meaningless unfulfilled promises at international environmental conference after international environmental conference, going right back to Rio, and I think it's 1991 or 1992, our capitalist rulers remain completely wedded to fossil fuels and the other aspects of their mode of production which are devastating our planet. The reality is that capitalism as it exists today is very much fossil fuel capitalism. There are the state-owned companies and the links between the major fossil fuel corporations and finance capital that I just mentioned. And if you take a look at any of the lists of the biggest and the richest companies in the world, you will see the big petrochemical multinationals figuring very prominently in any of those lists. And there's also the very ubiquitous use of plastics in manufacturing. I was looking at the numbers for this. In 1976, the volume of plastics produced internationally was 50 million metric tons, rising to 200 million metric tons in 2002, and reaching 368 million metric tons in 2019. And you just have to look around you, in your house, anywhere, at work. Plastic polymers are everywhere, and virtually all of it comes from fossil fuels and is reliant on fossil fuels. So in face of this reality, I'm personally amazed that the Green New Deal proposals are all premised on the idea that it is possible to make the changes required to avert the coming catastrophe, all within the framework of capitalism. It's quite clear what international capitalism is committed to. What has been the response of those sections of the radical left who have been giving this issue the prominence it deserves? So I'm going to focus on a couple of high-profile examples, John Bellamy Foster and Andreas Malm, who people may be aware of already. In that earlier quote I gave from The Robbery of Nature, which incidentally is a book which I would recommend people to read. People may be surprised to hear what John Bellamy Foster, who's probably the world's preeminent eco-socialist, has to say in terms of concrete program. Well, Foster mostly writes about the importance to Marx and Engels of the idea of a metabolic rift between humanity and the environment, and his latest book goes into much more detail than he has previously, giving other examples, which is why I think it's an important book for people to read. In November 2019, in a monthly review article where he was looking at Naomi Klein's book On Fire This Time, Foster started talking about what he described as being the beginnings of an ecological revolution that he thinks is supposedly happening today. And in that article, he correctly noted that none of the Green New Deal proposals are anywhere near to conceiving, much less tackling, the immensity of the task that the current planetary emergency demands. However, at the very same time, somehow, this did not prevent him from endorsing the Green New Deal proposals of the left of the Democrats, Sanders and Cortez, and the Green Party in the USA. And he's aware of that contradiction, and his justification for these is that these proposals in those radical Green New Deals, and to quote him, constitute what in socialist theory is called revolutionary reforms. That is, reforms that promise a fundamental restructuring of economic, political, and ecological power, and that point toward, rather than away from, the transition from capitalism to socialism. And he argues that these Green New Deal proposals are sufficiently grounded in necessity that they could spark a global revolutionary struggle for freedom and sustainability, since the changes contemplated go against the logic of capital itself and cannot be achieved without a mobilization of the population as a whole on an emergency basis. Of course, the idea that reformist incremental changes might somehow, someday, semi-automatically result in a revolutionary socialist transformation will be familiar, I imagine, to many of the people listening to the meeting today, because they'll be equated with the two-stage theory of the Social Democrats and the Stalinists. Now, once again, interestingly, in this article, Foster is actually quite explicit in his advocacy of a two-stage process. He argues, it is important to recognise that an ecological and social revolution under present historical conditions is likely to pass through two stages that we can call eco-democratic and eco-socialist. The self-mobilisation of the population will initially take an eco-democratic form, emphasising the building of energy alternatives combined with a just transition, but in a context generally lacking any systematic critique of production or consumption. Eventually, however, the pressure of climate change and the struggle for social and ecological justice, spurred on by the mobilisation of diverse communities, can be expected to lead to a more comprehensive eco-revolutionary view, penetrating the veil of the received ideology. Now, Foster doesn't really speculate about how long it may take for this eco-revolutionary consciousness to develop, but presumably the eco-democratic stage would have to unfold over the course of multiple 4 or 5 year electoral cycles. However, his own analysis, as we heard in that initial quote, where he talks about the depth and the urgency of the crisis, surely speaks directly against wasting precious time passively waiting and hoping for the masses to finally see through the radical sounding talk of the Green New Deal reformists and come to a revolutionary consciousness. Surely it is obvious that Marxists have a responsibility to try to find ways to accelerate what Foster terms the penetration of the veil of received ideology, and thereby hasten the day when eco-revolutionary consciousness becomes dominant in the workers' movement, rather than leaving this as some kind of objective process that is just going to happen. So on the other hand, the Bolshevik tendency believes that revolution should be right now, be telling the bitter truth that all the various Green New Deals are fatally flawed, as indeed we're doing in this forum now. As is usual in such scenarios, Foster's initial eco-democratic stage sidesteps the problem posed by the commitment of the repressive capitalist state apparatus to defending the interests of those who benefit from the status quo. And for a moment, let's just imagine what would happen if the advocates of a Green New Deal ever gained enough influence through parliamentary means to actually threaten imposing even just serious regulatory restrictions on profit making, let alone threatening the capitalist system as a whole, just if they were to threaten serious regulation. And we would all know that powerful corporate interests in the world would, of course, respond with a barrage of tactics, both legal and illegal, aimed at avoiding, or at least indefinitely delaying, any significant concessions. You can see this happening in the global south now against environmental activists who threaten the profits of individual capitalists by opposing their ecological damage. Now, Foster does kind of acknowledge this danger, but he treats it as a problem that can be postponed until the ecological revolution, which he says is going to happen spontaneously, has reached its full development. How he argues it. ecological revolution faces the enmity of the entire capitalist system. At a minimum, it means going against the logic of capital. In its full development, it means transcending the system. Under these conditions, that is, when we're ready to transcend the system, the reactionary response of the capitalist class, backed by its rearguard on the far right, will be regressive, destructive, and unrestrained. Ecological barbarism or eco-fascism are palpable threats in the current global political context and are part of the reality with which any mass ecological revolt will need to contend. Only a genuine revolutionary and not a reformist struggle will be able to propel itself forward in these circumstances. So that does pose the question of the class nature of state power that is going to be carrying out these tasks, which are going to be occurring through the eco-democratic stage and then the eco-revolutionary stage. Andreas Malm provides an answer to that, where he argues about capitalist state power. He comes at it slightly differently than Foster does. So for Malm, he's talking about ecological Leninism leaps at any opportunity to wrest the state in this direction, acting with the speed required by the reality of the emergency, breaking with business as usual as sharply as required, and subjecting the regions of the economy working towards catastrophe to direct public control. What state? And indeed, Malm recognises that as an issue. So he says, but what state? We have just argued that the capitalist state is constitutionally incapable of taking these steps. And yet, there is no other form of state on offer. No worker state based on Soviets will be miraculously born in the night. No dual power of the democratic organs of the proletariat seems likely to materialise anytime soon, if ever. Waiting for it will be both delusional and criminal. And so all we have to work with is the dreary bourgeois state, headed to the circuits of capital as always. It would have to be popular pressure brought to bear on it, shifting the balance of forces condensed in it, forcing apparatus to cut the tethers and begin to move, using the plurality of methods already hinted at, some further outlined by the present author in How to Blow Up a Pipeline, Learning to Fight in a World of Fire. But this would be clearly be a departure from the classical program of demolishing the state and building another, one of the several elements of Leninism that seem ripe or overripe for their own obituaries. I mean, that's quite bizarre, really. And in the name of eco-Leninism, Andreas Malm explicitly rejects and even wants to write the obituary for a core programmatic element of Leninism. That is the need to overthrow the capitalist state repressive apparatus and replace it with a new form of state based on the mass democratic control of Soviet-type bodies. But despite all his oh-so-revolutionary Leninist rhetoric, Malm, just like Foster, ends up with a concrete perspective that amounts to the run-of-the-mill reformist fantasies about using the capitalist state apparatus as the engine for progressive social change. Unlike in Foster's two-stage schema, there is actually no way to calculate in advance the speed at which political consciousness will be transformed, nor indeed the exact course it will take. But it is obvious enough that the illusions prompted by all the various Green New Deal schemes can only retard the development of eco-revolutionary sentiment. And we see that now in political struggle. The stronger the reformists are, the weaker the revolutionaries will be. Those Marxists who back any of the various iterations of the Green New Deal on the grounds of political realism just obscure the simple truth that only the establishment of an entirely different political and economic order can avert ecological collapse. It's ironic, but their cunning plan actually stands in the way of what they say they're for. Now, it might be said that this could mean that we're just going to shout revolution from the rooftops. But obviously at the same time, this is not to reject the need to support any positive proposals that are put forward by the Green New Deal reformists or other environmentalists. Communists should support progressive demands that are feasible within the framework of capitalism. And like, for instance, A few might be for what free, widely available, electrically powered public transport, for an expansion of public healthcare free at the point of delivery, so as to combat future pandemics and increases in disease-carrying parasites resulting from climate change, for an expansion of recycling facilities, for a transformation from industrial monocultural style farming to sustainable farming methods such as permaculture, biodynamics, hydroponics, polyculture, and crop rotation, for a refit of all housing and commercial stock, improve energy efficiency and move to electrically powered heating systems, for a massive expansion of all renewable energy sources, including the use of small-scale thorium-based fourth-generation nuclear reactors, massively increased research into replacements for fossil fuel-based plastics, for full retraining on full rates of pay for any workers needing to be redeployed as a result of these changes, for education encouraging a move away from meat to plant-based diets, for reforesting and rewilding of clear-cut areas. And there will, of course, be many other demands, and there are interesting immediate solutions which are being put forward, which are supportable, and there'll be many which have actually been thrown in the dustbin because they weren't considered to be economic. Alongside immediate demands like these, there will also need to be the range for more wider-ranging changes, primarily aimed at removing the massive waste that is built into the processes of capitalist production for profit. And this will be particularly true in the imperialist countries where the per head energy use is very high. Foster and Clark describe some of these wasteful processes in The Robbery of Nature. 1, a gargantuan and ever-expanding sales effort penetrating into the structure of production itself. 2, planned obsolescence, including planned psychological obsolescence. 3, production of luxury goods for an opulent minority. 4, prodigious military and penal state spending. And 5, the growth of a whole speculative superstructure in the form of finance, insurance, and real estate markets. Now, it is true that if you take those immediate demands and those demands against the waste of production, they do start to strike at the very heart of the capitalist mode of production. Now, we in the Bolshevik tendency argue that a revolutionary program must therefore include the obvious conclusion that it will be necessary to socialise the processes of production, distribution, and exchange to bring all of this about. We need to be clear that the anarchy of a market based on profit maximisation must be replaced with democratically controlled planning on an international scale. And as well, we need to tell it is necessary to tell the truth that the struggle for this social transformation will require the overthrow of the capitalist state repressive apparatus and the creation of new forms of mass democratic governments. We will need to build a revolutionary party based on this kind of programmatic perspective, a party that is capable of leading a movement comprising the vanguard militants of our class, which is able to end this insane and anti-human capitalist socio-economic system. The Bolshevik tendency is committed to participating in that process, and we seek collaboration with all those who share that aim. Hopefully the discussion at today's meeting will play a small part in that process. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Okay, so we'll open up for discussion now. Any speakers, raise your hands. I'll look out for you. And I should have said as well, you can ask a question in the chat function as well, or make a comment there for Alan to pick up. So yeah, use the raise hand function to speak. I've got 2 people so far. That's Jason and Christoph. So I'll take Jason first. And Christoph, I don't know whether you lowered your hand. Anyway, I'm gonna, right, so I'll take Christoph after.
I just wanted to pick up on what Alan had said. The vocabulary used in politics is, I think, telling, and political names are never devoid of history. The appropriation of the New Deal reveals a great deal about the illusions, I think, in reformist liberal solutions, as well as the opportunism and sometimes amnesia on the ostensible left. Thus, when so-called socialists promote environmental plans under programs modeled on the New Deal, it tells us more about their own deep illusions and the possibility of fixing capitalism than it does about the solution to the existential threat that faces humanity. In America, New Deal rhetoric is kept in circulation to the benefit of the Democratic Party, and it serves, as it always has, to give a populist gloss to an essentially conservative party committed to maintaining capitalist rule. Whether it's AOC proposing a Green New Deal legislative package ripe for pork in order to gather votes from her congressional colleagues, or the critical support given to said project by Monthly Review editor John Bellamy Foster, who correctly identifies some of its limitations, but nevertheless sees it as an entry point. Such rhetoric sows dangerous illusions in the liberal democratic state as an instrument that can be wielded to protect the interests of humanity. The real story of the New Deal belies this and teaches us that this will reap a bitter harvest. Contrary to years of democratic myth-making, the New Deal was not a product of progressive struggle. Neither did it start as an economic master plan. Most of what the Democrats said and did, then as now, was simply to obtain votes. Hoover ran a deficit and FDR campaigned on reducing it. The Roosevelt campaign accused the Republicans of leading the country down the path to socialism by proposing government investment in public works like dam construction. But it was FDR's intuitive patrician opposition to the proposed Glass-Steagall banking regulations that led him in 1933 to begin pushing a recovery plan based on business-government cooperation. And big business backed FDR not because they thought he was a visionary who could fix capitalism, but because of his trusted pedigree as a C-average Harvard alumnus whose intellectual horizons didn't extend beyond stamp collecting. The FDR administration was not composed of radicals, but businessmen. From Papa Joe Kennedy to the trade association lobbyists who wanted protection from more rapacious business practices and therefore proposed an elaborate code structure that incidentally included the regulation of labor costs. They hoped that they'd be less competitively disadvantaged if wages were equalized across the country, even if it meant allowing unions to organize and banning child labor. This was a legitimate difference among the ruling class. Some businessmen had been shaken up enough to hope regulation could protect their own financial interests, as well as diffuse class conflict by smoothing over some of capitalism's roughest edges. The pressure on big business to accept ameliorating reforms was certainly real. The Soviet Union still existed as an alternative path for American workers, and this was before the mass disillusionment of the Stalinist show trials or the Hitler-Stalin Pact. Even so, the American ruling class was divided and disorganized. Most union growth in the 1930s is attributable to the willingness of desperate workers to strike rather than the paltry legislative reforms which made it a little easier for unions to obtain recognition in exchange for significant concessions by labor misleaders. Our forerunners among the earlier generation of revolutionary Marxists correctly criticized the New Deal and advocated organizing the unemployed, initiated union drives led by militant caucuses, and attempted to organize workers within the WPA and labor camps, which were the ultra-exploitive workfare of that day. Ultimately, the problem with appropriating the New Deal nomenclature is not just that such revisionism paints a false picture of the past and helps the Democratic Party in its role as gravedigger of social struggles, but also that it ignores the fact that the New Deal failed. Even true Keynesianism can't solve the contradictions of capitalism or halt the falling rate of profit. And FDR's half-hearted pragmatic mishmash certainly didn't do so. Capitalism can't be fixed. It was munitions orders and the war economy that jump-started the US economy. The mass military mobilization of young working class men finally solved unemployment, and the American century was born of the lucrative reconstruction contracts to rebuild countries devastated by the barbaric conflict of the Second World War. We can't afford to make that mistake again with the Green New Deal. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Go ahead, Christoph.
Yes, hi there. I want to talk a little bit about the Democratic Socialists of America and their approach to the Green New Deal. It is, of course, the largest self-styled socialist organization in the United States, and they have been cheerleaders for Senator Bernie Sanders, who I think can be credited for popularizing the idea of a Green New Deal in the United States. And of course, Congresswoman and DSA member Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez actually introduced a bill in Congress for a Green New Deal. Now, one thing that struck me when I looked over the DSA writings on the topic is that they like to present facts and figures without putting them into context. Here's an example. They write that fossil fuel companies are investing billions in low or no carbon fuels. And that is true. However, as Alan pointed out, these figures are actually dwarfed by what funding has been made available by the banks to the fossil fuel companies since the Paris Agreement. It's a staggering 2.7 trillion. In other words, the investment in fossil fuel companies is 1,000 times that of investment in low carbon or no carbon fuels. That gives you an idea of the scope of difference. And of course, Alan explained that we are talking about fossil fuel capitalism. DSA argues really that there are different sectors competing for dominance within the state structure. And they complain that left criticism, as presented by Alan and the Bolshevik tendency, really equates to a pessimistic approach, because we're not embracing what can really be done in the here and now, apparently. So instead, DSA argues for a stance of critical support to the Green New Deal. And because in their concept, there are, good capitalists and bad capitalists, there really is the need in their mind to fight the factions of the fossil fuel capitalists, which of course opens the door to any kind of alliance with sectors of capital that are not directly tied to the fossil fuel industry. So really, we're looking through the DSA lens at a struggle between the good green capitalists versus the bad fossil fuel capitalists. That provides the framework. And of course, it is the basis for what we would call a potential popular front between working class organizations and sectors of capital. From history, we know that this only serves the interests of capital and ends in tragic defeat for the working class. I don't have time to go into examples of this, but they can easily be referenced. The other aspect is that apart from this wrong approach based on a wrong concept of what should be done, the practical solutions that the DSA suggests are really very timid. So the Green New Deal principles that they outline talk about that, quote, we demand a Green New Deal, and they equate this with revolutionary transformation. A Green New Deal, as Alan pointed out, as it currently exists, or even in a slightly more radical version, is about as much a revolutionary transformation as Bernie Sanders' campaign for president represented a political revolution. In other words, zero. There are, of course, many supportable demands that a Green New Deal cites, of course. However, how do DSA suggest we get there? They say they call for a redistribution of resources from the worst polluters with just and progressive taxes on the rich and big corporations. In essence, DSA are suggesting a more progressive tax reform. That is what it boils down to, which of course is a direct appeal to the Biden administration, to the Democrats, to save us. That as a concept and as a concrete proposal is utterly futile. Thank you.
Thank you, Christoph. I've got Sebastian and then Dara, and I haven't got any other speakers after that so far. Go ahead, Sebastian.
Hi, I want to say I very much agree with what Alan said and his statement. But I want to ask, he spoke about some demands which he termed progressive. And I want to ask, are these demands the Bolshevik tendency would propose, or these demands where the Bolshevik tendency would say, if somebody else brings them into the political, into a political movement, we would yes, participate in demonstrations for these demands. Or and in what kind of connection are these demands to the transitional program? That's my question. Thank you.
Thanks, Basti. Go ahead, Dara.
Thanks, Roxanne. Really enjoyed the lead off from Alan. And yeah, I just want to pick up on something that Alan spoke about when he mentioned that a lot of the left, for example, in Britain here, myself as a supporter of the Bolshevik tendency, noted that many on the British left have rightly pointed out, like the Socialist Party and the IMT, who are part of the militant tradition, that the Green New Deal, being based on Roosevelt's New Deal, is no more than a collection of policies which seek to find solutions to capitalism's problems within the confines of the limits of capitalism itself. Yet, in the same breath, these groups will admit this, but also claim that a socialist New Deal, Green New Deal, brought in by a Labour Party government or some reformist party that might be left-wing enough would be a progressive step towards socialist revolution. For example, in 2019, the Socialist Party claimed that a Labour government carrying out the Green New Deal would be a big step in the right direction towards addressing the climate crisis, but it must be funded by the wealth currently hoarded by the super rich, and new green industries must be publicly owned and run democratically by the workers and trade unions, which is a very confusing and contradictory point to put across, in my opinion, at least. Last year, the IMT released their thesis on the climate crisis, in which they claimed that positive steps have been taken to link the environmental question to left-wing demands, most notably the Green New Deal being a rallying cry for those around Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and a motion for a socialist Green New Deal based on public ownership and democratic control of the economy was passed at the Labour Party conference in 2019. Promoting illusions in bourgeois democracy seems to be a linchpin of militant tradition politics, as I noted in my 2017 resignation letter from the Socialist Party, in which I said, as Marxists, one of our most fundamental principles is that the bourgeois state needs to be smashed and replaced with genuine proletarian democracy based on the abolition of private property. This is in stark contrast to the Socialist Party's call for a parliamentary road to socialism, the programmatic demand to nationalise the commanding heights of the economy to transition to socialism. This is often defended by supporters of the militant tradition by claiming that it's a transitional or conscious raising demand. But a transitional demand is one that raises the question of state power, attempting to transform the consciousness of the exploited and oppressed, and by definition, cannot be achieved under capitalism. Trotsky had choice words for these kinds of false socialists. Quote, this way of acting characterizes very aptly people who try with hollow formulas to deceive the workers with the confusion that reigns in their own heads. The Marxist revolutionary must speak clearly of the need to work for the new party and the new international. Otherwise, despite all revolutionary formulas, there is always the risk of becoming the agent of one of the old parties. Each example of vagueness will serve the enemy class, whose pressure on the working class becomes tremendous as the war approaches. Similarly, the Socialist Workers' Party in Britain argue that the Green New Deal, despite falling far short of qualitative socialist demands, deserves support, arguing that, quote, fighting for the measures will strengthen the struggle for the environment and will make people more confident in fighting for better houses, wage rises against racism, and so on, end quote. This position is of no surprise to revolutionaries familiar with Tony Cliff's position on the transitional programme, nor is it unique among the British left, many of whom reject it on the basis that it is outdated or composed of dogmatic, impractical reforms. Instead, these quote-unquote Trotskyists limit themselves to immediate demands which reflect the current popular moods of the working class, i.e. bourgeois consciousness. In the final analysis, all the criticisms of the transitional programme, fetishism, dogmatism and catastrophism, boil down to the advocacy of a return to the minimum maximum programme of the Second International, that is to say, reformism now and socialism later, i.e. never. Marxists must take the long view of history and not permit the struggle for a little bit today to displace the historic necessity to fight for workers' power. Ending the ravages of imperialist disorder requires overturning the tyranny of capital and establishing a socialist planned economy based on production for human need rather than profit. Yet the force is necessary to lead larger and more decisive revolutionary struggles. And in the future can only be accumulated by politically intersecting those who are prepared to resist the effects of global capitalism today and struggling to help them transcend reformist and petty bourgeois utopian illusions. Thank you. Finished.
Thank you, Dara. I've got Catherine and then Michael up next. Go ahead, Catherine. I'll ask you to unmute, Catherine. Okay, you're still muted at the moment. Okay, I'm going to go to Michael. I think Catherine's dropped off there. Go ahead, Michael.
Oh, hello, this is, one thing I was a little curious about was there's been an argument by a lot of vegan types that, you know, eating meat's bad for the environment, stuff like that. However, there's pushback from, for example, David Walters, the Marxist internet arguer, saying that it's actually worse for the environment to do non-meat alternatives. I'm curious to know if you guys have an opinion or if you know a lot or no, oh, well, sorry, you know stuff that you know about this particular thing. I mean, I'm curious to know what, yeah.
Okay, that was just a query from Michael. Thank you. And I can see that, have you finished, Michael?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, I was curious to know what your guys' take on that kind of controversy thing is.
Okay, thank you. And then Tom, you were unmuted there. Go ahead.
Right. I missed Michael's question, so somebody else have to comment on that. We're having a few technical difficulties here. I did want to speak to briefly to what Sebastian was raising in relation to the transitional program and the demands that we would be putting forward. I think that what Alan was outlining was the sorts of demands that are getting raised by intelligent people who have some concern about this critical issue and what our attitude towards them would be. And the ones that he outlined things that we think, are not going to be sufficient, but we would certainly be prepared to participate in any activity supporting them. The fact is that very small propaganda group of revolutionaries, as we are, the masses aren't interested particularly in what we have to say, and I'm sure that our attendance at today's meeting will reflect that. The masses aren't particularly interested in what the DSA is proposing, or many larger formations. What the masses, when I'm talking about masses, we mean tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people. What they go into motion over is the effect the real world is having on them. And the real world is having a lot of effect on a lot of people currently. This week, the governor of Georgia noticed that there were an unprecedented number of Georgia in the US, the southern state. They'd had a whole bunch of tornadoes that had ripped up the state, and he was, commenting, what was the reason for this, and and how distressing this was. Not putting it in a context, but probably lots of people are. I'm sure there are lots of people today who've been using the power of prayer to address this problem. Another power that's been used is the power of denial. There's been a lot of funding for climate denial formations that have had probably some effect on popular attitudes. These effects are going to diminish, of course, as phenomena such as the governor of Georgia was commenting on increase. We anticipate that, well, it's quite clear that climate change is rapidly advancing, as Alan outlined. I thought a lot of what he presented is very powerful evidence. And what we anticipate is that there's going to be enormous political movement in response to this. There are going to be a lot of different things being put forward, a lot of different sorts of reforms being proposed. But the problem for revolutionaries is going to be to find ways to make clear to the large numbers of people who are going to be involved that it's necessary not only to try to implement these reforms, but to undertake struggles that cut at the base of the capitalist stability and ultimately challenge the rule of the capitalist class. The place where this was done successfully was in Russia, of course, under the Bolsheviks, the Russian Revolution in 1917. It provides a helpful model. The Bolsheviks were, a large-ish group, but only a few tens of thousands of people at the beginning of 1917. And by the end, they were leading the overwhelming mass of the peasantry and the working class. And they successfully overthrew the state. And the way they did it wasn't just by making declarations, but by addressing the felt needs of the people who were confronting problems like starvation and war, et cetera, and addressing them in ways that there were practical solutions, but that were also not confined within what was reasonable or tolerable to the capitalists in Russia at the time. And Leon Trotsky codified this in the transitional program. He sort of boiled down the Bolsheviks' concrete interventions into some sort of relatively abstract formula that would be applicable in many different societies. And I think this is a valuable model for us, that it's necessary to address objective problems, but it's necessary for revolutionaries to find ways to point the struggle in the direction of opposition to capitalism. So today, for example, in North America, there have been major struggles by indigenous people to stop tar sand oil coming across their territory. We, of course, would support that and participate in those mobilizations. But such struggles to prevent things from getting even worse than they are obviously not sufficient. So we would seek in intervening in such struggles to raise a demand, for example, to expropriate the oil companies. This is within the framework. It's conceivable that a capitalist state could do that. The Mexicans did it in the 1930s. But obviously it is in the direction that the capitalists are not interested in going. We would call for expropriating oil to nationalize the energy sector of the economy. Again, a practical solution, a necessary solution, but not one that's going to be promoted by Shell or BP. It's necessary, obviously, to massively expand energy production through non-destructive technologies, as Alan indicated, to control carbon emissions and to reduce carbon emissions to something where the planet is going to remain habitable for another 100 years, et cetera. This is going to require massive investment. And of course, the practical solution you're going to get from Bernie Sanders and the DSA is, well, that possibility doesn't exist. Well, what we would respond and what we would advocate within the masses is it's necessary not only to expropriate oil companies and energy sector, but also the financial sector, expropriate the banks and the hedge funds, create a nationalized banking system, which can provide cheap credit to productive investment in necessary sectors, which would, of course, be governed in accordance, we would advocate, to the interests of humanity, not to the profitable returns on the previous owners of the banking system. One of the things which Alan alluded to is that there will be capitalist resistance. The capitalists will argue against it. They'll have think tanks proving it can't work. They'll array all kinds of opposition to it, and ultimately they will attempt to control a mass upheaval against the destruction of the environmental movement that's against the destruction of the environment that's moving in the direction of opposition to capitalism. They will intervene with physical force, gangs of thugs, fascists, state agents. And it will be necessary as this begins to develop to advocate workers' squads for self-defense that will eventually turn into potentially workers' militias and would create the basis for a worker state. So we don't see it's the approach of revolutionaries in this situation has to be to not conceal the fact it's necessary to get rid of capitalism, but also not simply to counterpose socialist revolution as the answer to every particular problem, but rather to attempt to intersect the concerns of people around particular issues and direct it in ways that it can succeed and it can win, and that will, of course, in that context, necessarily point to the necessity for socialist revolution.
Thank you, Tom. So far, I've got one other speaker, HP. Just before I bring HP in, I've also got a question from Nicholas that I'll read. Alan may have seen it. And also a response from Yuri to Michael. But I won't read that out, but Alan might want to incorporate that in his response. Nicholas asks, well, he says he's interested to hear the extent to which Alan thinks we can see the impending ecological catastrophe as representing capitalism's death agony, beyond that which can be surpassed successfully by capitalism, by technological expertise or neo-Keynesianism, and also interested potentially in the potential relevance of transitional demands in that context. So another query on transitional demands. Thank you, Nicholas. So Alan could come back on that. HP, go ahead.
Hi, I just want to quickly pick up on the transitional program question, because there's one movement in Germany that I thought tried to, well, they didn't have the socialist end goal in mind necessarily, although there were elements who probably at least subjectively did. The movement is called Ende Gelände. They were trying to tackle the energy company RWE, which tried to knock down and has meanwhile knocked down an old tree in old forest in Western Germany in order to dig out brown coal, which is sort of the most polluting type of coal you could possibly imagine. And they tried to engage actually unionized workers who were kind of in favor of this undertaking, because it obviously means that they'll keep their jobs for a while. And at least elements of Ende Gelände initially at least, tried to call for retraining of these workers so that they could be employed in other sectors, potentially in regenerative energy sectors, etc. So I thought that is kind of one of these things that we would be fighting for as part of a broader transitional program trying to address ecological needs. My main point is more about, though, a large entity that isn't capitalist, and that is China. And China has a bit of a checkered record in that it demonstrates to an extent that even with bureaucratic Stalinist planning methods, you can achieve a lot in terms of environmental aspects. But also it comes with the downsides of that are, to an extent at least, represented by its relatively large market sector that, you know, is part of its economy. So the upsides are, for example, the world's largest reforestation project up in Inner Mongolia. Some of the big cities have now in sort of public transport systems, quite modern ones, run entirely on electric energy, like the city of Shenzhen in the south, which is sort of China's big tech hub, or one of the two of them. And also perhaps indicative is that the Chinese solar industry is the world leading one. None of the imperialist countries can compete with the quality and price of Chinese solar panels, apparently. So those are definitely upsides. And the CCP has actually introduced sort of stricter environmentalist regulations, which aren't enforced all the time as well as you would hope. And obviously the breakneck industrialization that China underwent after Deng's reforms have caused a huge damage, desertification in particularly inland provinces and so on. Private capital, which in the search for maximum profit, sort of didn't really care about the environment, didn't care about workers' rights, as we know as well, and polluted rivers, etc. In terms of, and that's partly reflected also in China's engagement abroad. So you can, if you look at China's investment and sales of construction services, which plays a big part of its Belt and Road Initiative abroad in Africa, the energy comes up on top of all their investments and lending, etc. And most of these lending goes to regenerative energies, actually, and not coal or other fossil fuels. So hydro power is one of the big things. On the other hand, that doesn't mean that they're not necessarily, you know, ruling out the use of fossil fuels. In Pakistan, for example, they've built coal power plants, or are building coal power plants, mostly at behest of the Pakistani government, which thinks that it's the easiest and cheapest way to produce energy. And it's one of the big problems of the semi-colonial world anyway, to actually set up stable electricity. And that points at the global impact and the global considerations that really need to be at the forefront of our approach to this question, because whilst obviously the imperialist countries in particular are now in a position where they can probably cut quite a bit of wasteful spending and so on, in the semi-colonial world there are plenty of countries that are still not even at the level where they're industrialized, and so considerations obviously need to be taken of how we can, and that's a question more for after revolution really, how global production can be organized in a way whereby that doesn't come at the expense of nature. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
Thanks, HP. We haven't got any other speakers up at the moment. unless anyone wants to raise their hand right now. Otherwise, it's probably a good place to bring Alan in. We've had a few questions, and we've got plenty of time for a second round anyway. Okay, I'll hand over to Alan.
Okay, not to say there's an order, but Michael's question about meat versus plant-based diets. Actually, Yuri sent a reply, but it just went to the panelists, so most people won't have seen this, so I'm going to read it out. Michael, this is from Yuri. The climate impact of the agriculture industry is well researched. You've probably read something about factory-made vegan ready meals in relation to raw meat from an animal concentration camp. These comparisons, quotes, are made by think tanks paid by the meat industry. So I'm not aware of these arguments made by that a move to plant-based diet would be worse. As far as I can tell from my understanding of the science, that's not true. The energy transformation required to produce meat is many times, and I don't know off the top of my head what that number is, but it's many times much more than the energy use required to produce plant-based foods. Now, of course, there is a consideration that just as for meat-based farming, we'll want to change the ways that it's done, not the crazy way of these massive farms of single formal livestock. We'll also want to make changes in the way that plant-based agriculture is done, because they use that same monoculture and massive things, which is just ridiculous as well. And there's along both these forms of monoculture, industrialized farming are encouraging transmission of zoonosis type viruses like COVID. But in general, I think that in the context of a wider program which makes those points that we need to change the way that we do agriculture in general, making a change from meat-based and fish-based, because we are depopulating the oceans as well, to more plant-based does seem to make sense according to the science as I understand it. So if David Walters is arguing something else, I'd need to see that, because I'm not aware of that, any research arguing for that, other than what Yuri points out as propaganda by the meat industry think tanks. Nicholas, I think it's getting very close to that, that the danger of ecological collapse is posing the death agony of capitalism. I mean, but it's a death agony which is one which would pose a horrific barbarism and possibly even extinction, depending on which of the combination of feedback mechanisms caused by the tipping points come into place. If we get to 3 or 4 degrees over pre-industrial, then probably humanity will continue to exist, but in some horrific form, with warlord, barbarous rulers over little pockets fighting each other for increasingly depleted resources. If we get to 8 degrees over, if the methane feedback spins out of control and all the feedback mechanisms coming together, then human life could be posed as ending. So yes, I do think that we are facing the death agony of capitalism, because I don't think it is possible for capitalism to respond. And if you look at what's required, as in that first quote I gave right at the beginning from The Robbery of Nature, it's just not possible. You're asking the capitalists to not be capitalists, to not have capitalism, to not have a system based on infinite growth, to not have a system which is based on profit maximization, to not have a system where the decisions about what is produced and how it's produced are made in secret in boardrooms, hidden behind layers of commercial secrecy. That's all got to go. There's got to be, as Andreas Malm says, a conscious plan on an international scale. National boundaries have got to go. That's the reality of the level of the changes which are required, given the situation we're in. Capitalism can't respond. I think that's a reality. So the question of transitional program, Tom touched on a bit of what I was noting down, and that's that before we get to that kind of catastrophic ecological collapse where civilization starts to collapse and perhaps even extinction of humanity is posed, before we get to that, we're going to see a huge number of negative effects. These are all already beginning on that the World Meteorological Organization report refers to some of those. And we're going to see climate refugees. And something more recently I just saw in the last week was about the danger of a huge section of the planet around the equator becoming unlivable unless you are able to be inside air-conditioned housing, and the vast bulk of those people who live in that area in that area of the globe are not available. It's up to 3 billion people could be forced to move because it will be impossible to live, because you will die because of this thing called wet bulb temperature, which is particularly dangerous in high humidity areas. People should look that up. It's a major feature. So there's going to be major climate refugees, billions of people on the move in 20, 30, 40 years. But that's beginning now. Food and water scarcity, that's happening now, increasing every year on year. More people, food insecurity, more people, water insecurity. That's going to, and there's a danger that the disruption that's occurring right now to the Gulf Stream, which is seeing those unusually high temperatures and unusually low temperatures as the cold air is pushed down and the Arctic heats up instead, is disrupting farming for us in the imperialist world and the near imperialist world, like in Ireland. Then there's also the question of infrastructure destruction, as Tom referred to in Georgia. That was seen in California with the wildfires, in Australia with the wildfires, through Asia with the tornadoes and hurricanes, which are increasing year on year as the global temperature as a whole increases. What happens is you get more energy into the weather systems, and that means when you have storms, they're bigger. When you have hurricanes, they're bigger because there's just more energy in the atmosphere. So that infrastructure destruction is going to occur as well, and increasingly, it's going to become a regular thing. I think this is starting to become part of popular narrative that these 100-year events are now becoming decade events or even yearly events. That's certainly the case with the wildfires in California now. They're expected to be rage out of control. It's just where they're going to be. That's a reality of life now, and that's only going to get worse. So how's capitalism going to respond? Because it's not just that these are life-threatening for people, but they're also profit-threatening. What are they going to do? They're going to, as they always do, they do it with their economic crises, and they will do it with these crises, they will attempt to make working people pay. And so working people are going to have to respond. We're going to have to fight back against those attempts to make us pay. And as revolutionaries, we're going to participate in those fight backs. And to this extent, that people like Bellamy Foster are correct, there will be a movement against these effects of climate change, which are already locked in. Even if humanity is able to stop a catastrophic collapse, there's still going to be a lot of stuff which is just locked in by the amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere, by what we've done to soil degradation, by how much the mass extinction has disrupted the world ecosystem. So we're going to have to resist those things. It will be part of that resistance. But the difference is that we're not just going to be part of that resistance. Revolutionaries will seek to engage in that using the method of the transitional program. So if we go to a protest, as Tom pointed out, against oil pipelines, we will have, as part of the literature we're giving out, stop the oil pipeline. But we won't just stop there. We won't just hope that there will be this spontaneous development and consciousness of people being involved in these struggles. We will attempt to engage with those and raise these wider demands. Some of the demands around ending the waste. We'll attempt to make connection with the generalized ecological collapse. This is not just a problem of this particular pipeline. It's not just this particular problem of how they're trying to make working people pay for the destruction caused by the tornado or the flood. It's not just how we're trying to stop the capitalists from making us all pay for the food insecurity. We want to make a connection to the wider ecological collapse and the potential for a catastrophic collapse. And linking to that, we'll also want to openly and explicitly make the connection that the processes of production, distribution, and exchange have to be socialised, that there has to be a plan. And that is going to mean the overthrow of capitalism, we understand it. We believe that the capitalist state will respond against that, and we will see that, and we'll be able to take examples of how the capitalist state responds. We've seen that with the opposition to the pipelines. And you're going to see that as more as we attempt to respond, as there are strikes against particular effects of ecological collapse. The state will attack workers taking those actions, and we'll want to generalise that to workers' defence guards and point the way to war workers' militias and pose the question of the need to end capitalism. And so in that sense, rather than, it's not that, and how I kind of have come to understand the transitional program, it's not about writing a document which you just have and you can give it all the time. It's more a political method. So the transitional program is expressed as a method in how you intervene in any particular struggle or struggles. You attempt to link those struggles together. You have supportable immediate demands, and you will raise those immediate demands, but you won't just raise those immediate demands. You will raise wider demands, and you'll raise demands which point in the direction of workers' power and the ending of capitalism. And it's that method rather than any specific demands that we might raise at any particular moment, which is important in my idea. And it's also trying to make that link to what will be, I think, the inevitable working class struggle against those effects. And trying to combine that is the task which faces us. And we've got 2, 3, if we're optimistic, 4 or 5 decades to do that before basically it's too late. Finish.
Thank you, Alan. By the way, there are people talking to each other on the chat, but only writing their messages to the panelists. So you can't see each other's comments or replies, which hopefully I've written in the chat to let you know, but then some of you are still only writing to panelists. I know Alan read out some of them.
You have to click on the little down arrow by the 2, choose the all panelists and attendees.
Yeah, click on 2, and then you can choose who you write to, so an individual or panelists and attendees. Because most of the comments are interesting and probably would be of interest to everyone, especially if it's kind of an ongoing discussion about something. Anyway, so that's the end of our first discussion. I haven't got any other raised hands, but we've got plenty of time for a second round. So you can either come back, maybe responding to something that Alan said, or any new points. Anyone who hasn't spoken obviously will have priority, and plenty of room for people to come back for a second time to speak as well. So we'll open it up for second round. I've got Catherine so far, promoting you to a panelist. So Catherine will be able to speak in one moment. There we go. Go ahead, Catherine. Still muted at the moment. If I ask you to unmute, you might see the message pop up.
You unmuted, Rox?
Pardon?
You might have the option to unmute.
Have I got the, okay, I can just, I can't see that. I can see the option to ask to unmute. I might have to change it on my settings. If I can try and change it on my settings to, I got the option to stop someone being able to unmute themselves, but not the option to allow me to unmute them, as far as I can tell.
You should have the, Kathy, you should have the option to unmute down the left-hand corner.
In the left-hand column.
No, left-hand corner of the Zoom. You've got a, should be an icon for mute and for video.
Do you mean for the individual? Like if I go to
at her end, it should be Kathy, because Kathy can hear me.
Oh, right. So giving Kathy instructions. Yeah. Say that again. Sorry, Alan. So Kathy can hear you.
So on the Zoom screen, you've got the pictures of the three of us, or the two, Roxy and you and my icon. And then you've got the black part. In the bottom left-hand corner of the black part, you should have mute and unmute and stop video and start video. You should be able to unmute.
I lost the whole screen.
Yes, you're there. There you go.
Yeah. No, the whole screen disappeared on me. So it wasn't. Okay. Yeah. I mean, for us, for revolutionaries, I mean, it is always has been. It's like Trotsky said, it's socialism or barbarism. There's really no alternative, and that's been the case ever since we've been in the imperialist epoch, the beginning of World War I, and it's just gotten worse and worse. And the whole question of the ecology and the problems that capitalism has created for planet Earth are part of the increased irrationality of the capitalist system. Michael Moore and a couple of his cohorts came out with a documentary last year that caused quite a stir. And that was Planet of the Humans, and it sparked quite a bit of controversy within the environmental movement, because and a lot of largely as a result of some outdated information it had regarding solar energy, volt car, and the statistics for German energy outputs. And critics made a lot of fuss about this because of the outdated information on the solar energy thing. But for us, the more serious flaw in the documentary was the claim, well, a sort of claim that one of the problems with pollution was a result of overpopulation, and of course the increased fossil fuel pollution was a result. There were too many people, and population control would be necessary. I watched an interview done on the Hill with Moore and his two cohorts after the brouhaha over Planet of the Humans, and they said no, that wasn't their intention. It was misleading in the film. It certainly wasn't their intention that population control was on the agenda for them. Fossil fuel pollution comes predominantly from Western imperialist powers, obviously. And what the documentary did best was explore the whole question of greenwashing and how the main energy companies are behind a lot of these small, supposedly eco-friendly companies that are now pushing for the Green New Deal, so that it's sort of the wolf in grandma's clothes with the eco-washing. And I always remember years and years ago there was this thing, and it was a toxic waste removal truck. And I always remember this, Turtle Island recycling, but it was for the most toxic garbage imaginable from this construction site. And that's sort of like, they think if you can put a green package on it and put a dove or some other little forest creature on it, that's going to work to convince people that in fact this is a use and not a non-pollutant thing. Capitalism, of course, cannot, because of its very nature, that it has to constantly be searching of ways to make more money, that it's an irrational system. No matter how the little covers on it, it cannot be made to be something it's not. It cannot stop ecological collapse. It cannot stop war. It cannot stop any of this. They can tinker with it, but we're beyond the whole point of this whole thing is we're beyond the tinkering stage. We're at the stage where if humanity doesn't wake up and act soon, there isn't going to be a planet. you can already see in the Middle East over the control of oil, that the imperialist wars there, that those countries have become, basically no-go zones. They have no infrastructure. People are fleeing those things. You're getting a lot of xenophobia in Europe as a result of refugees from imperialist war, and this is going on and on. More talks about what the Planet of the Humans did a fairly good job of was raising the question of that capitalism is the basic root cause of ecological disaster. And of course, Moore and his cohorts, their framework for it, while they talk about capitalism, is to sort of support some form of reform with the Democratic Party. So they operate within the confines of the electoral system, but and that's a big following. But it acknowledges that the climate catastrophe is a direct result of capitalist mode of production, and that and the capitalists seeking increased profits. So the built-in obsolescence, the use of plastics and everything, all the rest of it is very much a part of the irrationality of the way capitalist production is organized. And the whole idea that you're going to get together and they have, the capitalists will get together and have agreements and confabs and have Paris Agreement accords, like in 2015, which they're just window dressings in window dressings, and in actual fact, nothing fundamentally is going to change. The documentary Planet of Humans made it clear that case for the proposition that capitalism is capitalism that has brought humanity to the brink of ecological collapse. And a simple increase in sort of eco-friendly technology, or even a large one, can't save the current climate crisis a la Green New Deals. That the immensely destructive system of capitalist production must be replaced by a rationally planned economic system that's based on human need rather than profit. And until we have that, we're going to just see more and more of the same. And the ocean is getting, as Alan outlined, everything is getting worse. Nothing is getting better. And we are seeing a weather change. And you realize how vulnerable humanity actually is when it has, when there is a tornado or hurricane, like the storm in Texas, that all of this, everything you take for granted, the fact that you plug something in and electricity comes out and all your computers and everything work, and then suddenly it's all gone. It's complete. We are extremely vulnerable. We need, so the whole thing right now is that we definitely, desperately need to change the way the whole of society is organized. And the only way to do that is to have a socialist planned economy. And to do that, we have to build a serious revolutionary organization that has the capacity to address the questions that are facing us in the immediate term and connect them to the struggle for a socialist society. That's it. Right.
Thanks, Kathy. I haven't got any other speakers at the moment, but I've got an interesting point by Yuri challenging Alan on the question of nuclear technology. Seeing as we don't have any other speakers at the moment, rather than me reading that out, I think I'll leave it to Alan, if he can come back now, and then he can address that and any other points that he perhaps didn't have time to come back on. And yeah, so, and I don't think I said at the beginning as well as the being able to ask a question on the panelists and attendees chat, you can also ask a question on the Q&A function, which is quite a clear way of doing it. Okay, over to Alan.
Yeah, well, just to pick up a couple of points that Yuri's made in the chat there, I think that last point was made to all attendees, so people have seen it. But one he made, which was just a panelist, was he did have the numbers on beef production versus plant-based production. And I do remember reading this myself. For producing beef, which is the main meat-based product, to get 1 unit of protein, whatever that is, gram or kilogram of beef protein, it takes 7 units of plant protein. So you have to use 7 units of protein to get 1 unit of protein in this other format. Whereas if you're eating those 7 units of plants, you wouldn't have to have as many cows to produce the same amount of protein. So Yuri's made a comment there about nuclear power and this latest floating nuclear power station, basically a big boat with 2 reactors on it. The reactors are submarine reactors that the Russians use in their nuclear submarines. And I think, and given how much that costs, it's over $200 million US dollars equivalent to produce, the actual and the costs of running it mean that the return on investment for the energy you're getting out is actually very, very poor as compared to other ways of producing energy. And that's true, and it is a problem with all the existing big nuclear power plants. That's true. I think Yuri's correct in that. They're not the answer. Very few people point to them being the answer. Some might say they may play part of that. But I think that there are new forms of, well, not new actually, thorium-based reactors have been known since the 1960s, but for reasons which are perhaps a bit unclear, capitalism chose to go with uranium-based fuel for reactors, and it may be that it being easier to produce nuclear weapons was a consideration there, or there may have been other economic reasons. I haven't seen a clear analysis of that, but they basically killed the research into these smaller thorium-based reactors, and that's what we're talking about. 4th generation, 5th generation. There are these new forms of nuclear power which are inherently safer. My understanding up till recently had been that it was not possible to create nuclear weapon material from them, but it now appears from some new research I've read that that is possible, but it's harder than with uranium, and it's not as directly a byproduct from these reactors. It is true that the storage of them is less long than it is for the big existing style nuclear reactors. So we think that should be looked at, and that technology should be invested in and seen if it's possible to make it work. There is another advantage to it, is that because they're smaller units generally, they favour a distributed power grid rather than the power grids that we have now, which are massive centres of power generation, which then have a big network coming out from that of power lines. Instead, you have a whole lot of smaller ones, and that can help with the problems they had in Texas, where their system broke down. If you have a distributed power system, it affects a much smaller of the total energy using population than if you have a more distributed system, which could happen with these thorium reactors. Now, it may be that there are other avenues for energy production, obviously, and obviously we favour other renewables, and even thorium has its dangers, but still, as a stopgap, it may be a useful thing, but not the big ones that exist now. They're all very dangerous. The water cooling is problematic, and so on. Yeah, just to talk a bit more about Nicholas's question about death agony, because another way that the death agony could occur would be nuclear war. Because if we don't get significant change and it's more or less business as usual, then sometime in the next couple of 2 to 3 decades, we're going to see those mass migrations. We're going to see full massive food scarcity, even affecting the imperialist heartlands. That's going to reflect itself, while capitalism remains, in military conflicts. And that could, given nuclear proliferation, spill over in a nuclear war, and that's got to be a real danger as well. So before there was an ecological collapse and civilization collapse caused by the inner processes of ecological degradation and climate change, humanity could push the button and get there quicker by nuclear war, and that's got to be a real danger as well. Hopefully it's not going to come to that. Yeah, finish. And I've got another little thing to say. I'm not sure if is this my last summary? Are we finishing?
We have got another question on the Q&A format from Lillian, which is quite pertinent. I think you did address it a little bit in your intro, but it's a different question to the others.
Yes, that's a very good question.
Yeah.
Because that comes up a lot in terms of just transition. So the question is, what about the radical dynamics of revolutionary change? How do we move towards radical change as the West and include the demands for historical, economic, social, and environmental justice of the South? We've just published an article on this, and we refer to this in where we discuss the question of degrowth, which is something we're not in favour of, how degrowth is currently discussed, but also in the context of in the imperialist West, the need to get rid of all the waste, and that's will reduce energy use in the West greatly. But so then there's a question, and so if we were able to have an international transformation away from capitalism to some socialist system, there are still going to be a lot of problems, and one of those problems is the imbalance in the world which capitalism leaves us. And in our article, we make the argument that in general, our approach as a world socialist entity would be to favour resources towards those who need them most. That would be a general rule, I think, which underlies socialist morality. And that would express itself in more, I think, resources being given to raising the conditions of the working people and masses in the global South. I think that's going to be particularly true in terms of if we get far enough where death from wet bulb temperatures becomes a problem in the equatorial regions, then we're going to have to deal with the migration of those people and providing resources for that to occur. And if we have a socialism which doesn't do that, which doesn't seek to raise all of humanity up, then it's not a socialism which I would want to be part of, or that I would understand as socialism. So that's how I kind of would answer that question, Lillian.
Okay. So feel free to come back on that, anyone. Yuri's got another point there in the chat. And maybe if we just leave it open for another minute to see if anyone wants to speak again or ask any other questions, make any other points in any of the formats that we have here. We do have one point there from Yuri. Mentioning renewable energies, well, I'll read that out. We have 10 years time to stop the climate deterioration. There is simply no time to be wasted on research of energy generating methods. In 10 years, all that is necessary must be in place and working on a global scale. We have to use the methods known and tested, renewable energies like PV and wind power. And I'm guessing that kind of links to Yuri's previous point that nuclear power research is too expensive. So both of those points, well, kind of linking to the limitations of within the capitalist framework. But Alan, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable point that Yuri makes. I mean, assuming that there was a social transformation in time, and that new society was being forced to make decisions, maybe Yuri's point is correct that trying to spend time getting thorium reactors from research models to working models would not be a valuable use of resources and time. I think we've actually got more than 10 years. Perhaps I'm optimistic there before it's too late. But I accept that as an argument. I think that the question of thorium-based, there's a lot of research has to be done about these. There are test models. The Chinese are working on getting production models. So that may not be a problem, but I accept that could be a problem. And that will be the case with many other forms of renewable power. I personally think that trying to work out the problems of wave power is something which has been massively under-resourced under capitalism. It's basically only happening in small theoretical units in universities. They're not really doing the research that should be happening with wave power myself. But those are decisions that would have to be taken as part of a rational plan. And certainly under capitalism, they've made their decision, and that the only forms of renewable power they're going to go with are solar and wind primarily, it seems. And the big gold rush that's occurring at the moment is over the batteries. How do you store that electricity? Because at the moment, that's a huge problem, that you lose so much in the storage. And there is a lot of research going into that. And that's important research as well, how to store the electrical power which comes out of whichever renewable or non-fossil fuel anyway form of energy production that you're using. So I accept that's but I do accept the underlying point, and Yuri may be right about that it would be a waste to spend time on that. The question is, are we going to be able to do it? And looking at the balance of forces, it's easy to get depressed about that. But I think that there is what keeps me going and stops me from falling into complete depression and dropping out of politics and trying to hide away from the world and ignore what's happening, is that it's still possible. And it's tied up to what I was talking about in my summary, that there's this strange thing happening in the world that because capitalism seems organically incapable of planning beyond 5 or 10 years, it can't deal with the reality of what's happened, that all what's been built up in ecological collapse and atmospheric carbon and increasingly atmospheric methane, that what that's going to mean. There are going to be all these effects, even if capitalism was able to solve it somehow magically. So let's say they solve the fission problem, the fusion problem, and you got nuclear fusion, safe nuclear fusion, cold, so you got more energy out than energy in, which is the problem with all the test fusion ones at the moment. You have to put more energy in than energy you get out. Let's say they solve that, and so you've got free energy available. There's still this huge problem of the effects which are built in. There's still the huge problem of how they're doing agriculture, what they're doing to the soil, how they're going to make, and who's going to have to pay. And even if that miracle was to occur, I still think we're looking at death agony, because what's built in so far, even if because you can't, it's not tomorrow. The transformation towards that new infrastructure is going to take a lot of time and a lot of resource, while we've got increasing chaotic weather, which is going to cause food scarcity, while we've got increasing areas of the globe where it becomes impossible to work outside during the daytime, where the infrastructure is increasingly destroyed, even in the most powerful imperialist country in the world, where there will be regularly trillions of dollars of destruction of the infrastructure every year. That's happening now. And that's going to increase because of the lag that occurs between the changes to the weather and the immediate climate from the build-up of the greenhouse gases. That lags behind. And so that's built in already. So but that is going to, big word, should result in working class struggle against how the capitalists will want to protect their profits against this destruction by making us pay. And in that struggle is when we need to be seated and when we need to be, and that's why the transitional program is so important. And what the real argument we have against Bellamy Foster or Andreas Malm or the Socialist Party or the DSAs, all of them who rely on that there will be an automatic change in consciousness, and their support for Green New Deal reformism, which is open and explicit, gets in the way and stops and hinders and is a brake on making that break to eco-revolutionary consciousness, to removing the veil of perceived ideology, as John Bellamy Foster. It's hugely ironic, and I really don't understand why they get that, but that the struggle is for groups like us and the people at this forum who agree with us, is how do we popularize that? I think that's our historic task. And that has been pointed out, it has been our historic task. But perhaps that because we are facing, as Nicholas asked, and I think correctly, the answer is yes, is that this danger of what ecological collapse poses is the death agony of capitalism. It poses, at the very best, the collapse of the civilization as we currently understand it. At the very worst, it throws us into a horrific barbarism, possible extinction. But capitalism cannot respond even to the built-in negative effects of the ecological collapse, which is already happening and is going to continue. So this is where quite often groups say, fill the form out, join. We think it's a bit more complicated than that. We want to engage people in discussion. We want to have these discussions around this general understanding of this general methodological approach. We think there are some conclusions about that. Someone mentioned, might have been Christoph, about the dangers of popular frontism, of looking to the progressive capitalists, the green capitalists, which is going to be a huge political problem. And it's a huge political problem which the Marxists who endorse the Green New Deal will find themselves in a bind with, because their Green New Deal proposers will, and indeed are, if you look at the DSA in particular, explicitly arguing for that. Saunders is looking to the green capitalists. They all look to the good green capitalists. Andreas Malm, the eco-Leninist, who wants to blow up pipelines, he looks to the capitalist state to be the engine for change. It's not. It's the engine to vend those trillions of economic units, pounds or euros or dollars, which are committed to continue use of fossil fuels. It's insane. It's completely insane. So if you agree with us that the general method we've proposed sounds reasonable, you should contact us and talk to us if you're not already a supporter. And depending on how those discussions go, maybe you want to make the step to joining us as a day-to-day collective, and that would be good as well. But you should talk to other people, talk to other groups, try and convince other groups of this methodology that you may be in contact with, because it would be very unlikely that the Bolshevik tendency is simply going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. It's likely that there will have to be a whole lot of fusions. There'll be a whole lot of reconfiguration of the left. We can already see that happening today. Groups collapsing, new groups arising, people looking at their ideas, reshuffling. And that process of discussion, debate, because we don't have all the answers. We think we're correct in general, but we want to discuss with other groups and individuals, and as part of that process, build a revolutionary party. But we're not saying join the Bolshevik tendency because we are the revolutionary party, or we will necessarily become the revolutionary party in a straight line. But it's take on that programmatic approach, that it's important to tell the truth, that it's necessary to end capitalism. It's important to tell the truth against the Green New Dealists. It means you don't support the Green New Deal as a program. You support revolutionary socialism as the overall program. And those two programs are counterposed. That will find us working together with them around particular demands, but at the same time, critiquing their overall perspective and critiquing anyone who supports that overall perspective. And pointing out, as we've tried to do in this forum, and we've tried to do in our articles on this question, pointing out the contradictions, which are, I think, quite astounding in what they say. They say that it's impossible to do it. The Green New Deal cannot be the answer. It's only by ending capitalism, and then support the Green New Deal proposals. Doesn't make any sense. And critiquing groups like us who critique the Green New Deal, critiquing groups who tell the truth, which they say is the truth. Finish.
Thank you, Alan. And thanks for what I think was a good discussion. We're just coming up to our 2-hour mark, so we'll end the meeting there. As Alan said, you can get in touch with us. Those of you who already signed up for the forum, you'll have got the email from contact@bolsheviktendency.org, our org email address. We've also got quite a lot of literature on this question on our website, bolsheviktendency.org, including in our Bolshevik journal, our relatively new Bolshevik journal. The first one is out with an article on this subject as well. We'll email out the recording to everyone, and it will also be put on the website. Okay, thank you everyone, and thanks for all the contributions. Thank you, Alan. Okay, see you later.